But that said, I think that we're in a very, very complicated time. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from the civil rights movement, but it takes a lot of different people reaching a boiling point and having a convergence of common concern. And it takes many different strategies. I mean, Thurgood Marshall used the law, and his colleagues, Charlie Houston, used the law to change the Constitution and had a long-term strategy. They didn't have a lot of money, but they were brilliant and they were persistent, and they had thought through how they were going to do this impossible thing. But secondly, it takes people who will challenge the law and sacrifice for that. He never really understood Thurgood, this nonviolent stuff. They were all terribly upset when students sat in the 60s. But as a young person growing up in segregated America, I was always waiting for the right thing, and we were always testing on a day-to-day basis. We would go into the public library in my little hometown where I couldn't go to the public library. I would always go. I would always go and challenge the daily things that you couldn't have white water or black water. And so from the beginning, there was never a time as a child when I didn't know I wanted to change segregation. And there were many people who sat down before Mrs. Park sat down and sparked something. So again, you just have to keep at it. It just takes a lot of different folk, and at the right time, it hits the right button, and things sort of happen. And so throughout my childhood, I was always challenging segregation and getting in a little bit of trouble. And I just, not to brag, but I'm just so proud. The very library, the one building I'm proud of my home county that wouldn't let me come to the library when I was a little girl. It's just named the best public library in South Carolina after me, and my whole town is so pleased because it's become the new center. And so things can change, and that's the other good thing. I mean, just bear in mind that it's hard, and it won't happen for long periods of time, but then you can really sort of make it change. But then change requires additional change. So multiple strategies, multiple voices, empowering people, empowering young people, having strong spiritual roots, because it is very tough. And it's very tough to withstand violence. And it hadn't been for the mass meetings and the communities coming together every night and trading stories about who almost got shot or who did get shot or what the last bit of beating was, but that need for community support. But it was also about a passion that just would not die. And I wish sometimes I could be like I was when I was 19, because we were absolutely prepared to die for change, and there was never any question about it. And I felt that same spirit in South Africa when I went to Soweto and saw the young people. I recognized myself. This is not a revolution that's going to go back. And you do reach a point when you've got to kind of have change. You need good mentors who affirm you, and you need the back and forth dialogue. When I was a student, my faculty members at Spelman College, which I love, they're very staid, and they opposed what we students were doing on the whole. 50 years later, they congratulated all the students. This is the 50th anniversary of the sit-in movement, and they now see that as the greatest thing that ever happened to their colleges, but 99% of them did not support it. But we always had one or two or three. And it is so important to find that one or two or three mentors. Howard Zen, who was, if you haven't read his People's History, but it was my favorite. He and I went to Spelman College the same year, and he was always the one that we could plot with secretly. And he was our PR person who called the police saying that my students are coming down to sit in all of your places. And so you need one or two or three, but not a whole lot, to kind of keep going. And you need good what I call good Moses, Miriam generation people to really help the Joshua, Deborah generation people. And I'm sure that at every faith there are these multi-generational leaders, but you did need the few who would sort of affirm and validate the struggle of young people who are often very insecure, but young people also need to have the courage of their convictions. Multiple strategies I've talked about. The nonviolence training was absolutely key. We knew that we were no match for the police or for the violence that could be imposed. And nonviolence training that Dr. King brought with him was very important, and we were really very disciplined. And again, that discipline came with the conviction that what we were doing was right and just, and we were prepared to die for it. But we really made unwelcome people who were not prepared to be violent, because the point was to bring about the change and to show that this simply had to happen, and to give the enemies no excuse for saying that it could not be done. And it's very moving to look back and see the 6-year-old boys and girls and the 7-year-olds. One of the movies that we show every one of our young trainees today is the Birmingham Children's March. Because while adults were not able to respond, Dr. King's very famous letter from Birmingham jail, where he called on everybody to come out and fill the jails, well, he got no takers except the children of Birmingham. And the children of Birmingham really did fill up the jails with their joy and their fearlessness, and they stood up to fire hoses. And so we show that to children today in our freedom schools and to college students, so that they can see what children did to transform America, and to see 6- and 7-year-olds. I'm talking about Tatum. They couldn't even say freedom, but they knew that they wanted to be a part of this change. And so it's just, it takes, again, multiple strategies, sacrifice, but the nonviolence training was absolutely crucial. The discipline was absolutely crucial. And the community support and the meetings each night to kind of sing through your fears and to be able to laugh at your fears and to have that community support. And again, being clear that it was never everybody. It was always a core of folks. SNCC was never more than 200 people, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, at one of its largest times. And so don't wait for everybody to come along. They're not going to come along. And I know as a student, because I was so blessed to have sat in a lot of the meetings, boy, was Dr. King constantly under attack. I mean, the different civil rights groups really did not like what he was doing. And it was wonderful. I was a fly on the wall to watch the interaction with adults and all criticizing the others. And one of the things I've tried to do in my new incarnation is to figure out, can you have a multiplicity of strategies in one organization so that the Urban League doesn't feel threatened or the NAACP doesn't feel threatened, but they all ganged up against Dr. King constantly until we students came in and were more radical than Dr. King. And so you just need this continuum of leadership that begins to push the bar. But change, bottom line, can happen. Here we are after years of legal change, Declaration of New Rights. The Children's March really did have an awful lot to do with the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65 in Birmingham and what went on in the follow-up. And we've got a lot of laws in the books. On the other hand, that has not translated into real equality, and in many ways this is the most difficult time I think we've ever faced in the United States, because while we have this miracle in the White House and Oprah reigns in the television, we have the largest gap between rich and poor that we've ever had, and we have got the emergence of, we're having a resegregation of American life in our schools, and we have what we call the cradle-to-prison pipeline. Where we're seeing the criminalization of children at younger and younger ages. The schools that we work so hard to desegregate are producing massive illiteracy. A majority of all American children of all race and income groups cannot read at grade level in 4th, 8th, or 12th grade if they have not already dropped out of school. And over 80%, closer to 85%, of all Black and Hispanic children cannot read or compute at grade level in 4th, 8th, or 12th grade, and it's a disaster. The toxic cocktail of illiteracy, massive illiteracy through school failure, and many of the schools never really desegregated. We had our peak in the 70s, and then it's been going backwards, and it's going backwards even faster. But the toxic cocktail of illiteracy, of continued racial disparities and economic disparities, with this huge gap between rich and poor, and child poverty is growing. When Dr. King died, we had 11 million poor children, and he was calling for a Poor People's Campaign. Today, we have 15.5 million poor children, about 7 million living in extreme poverty, and our economy is 3 times richer despite the economic downturn. But poverty, continued racial disparities, illiteracy, poor education, and the criminalization of children, particularly Black males. A Black boy today has a 1 in 3 chance, and a Latino boy a 1 in 6 chance of going to prison in his lifetime if they were born in 2001. And so we're back fighting a new Jim Crow. There's a marvelous book that I would recommend to you by a woman named Michelle Alexander. It's called Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. But, you know, she has wonderful little nuggets that scare you, and because one has to say, are we at the end of a period and the beginning of a post-Reconstruction era as we were historically, you know, a century ago, or can we find a way to keep moving ahead and not go backwards, because we're going backwards, and it's being fueled, as you see, the divisive voices all around by those who absolutely can't stand that there's a black president in the, you know, in the White House, cannot stand that the country is becoming a majority minority within the next 2 decades. And so the whole way of life as they see it is being threatened. And we also have the extraordinary escalation of wealth to the top at the expense of the bottom, and everybody's feeling very insecure. So this is a very dangerous time in America, requiring, I think, thoughtful voices, women's voices, young people's voices, calling for justice and moving ahead. But it's about economic justice. Dr. King died calling for a cross-racial, cross-class movement to end poverty in America. He pointed out the theft of the defense budget from the needs of hungry people here at home, as well as from the needs of hungry people in Vietnam. And so he drew these parallels between excessive military spending and excessive welfare for the rich, and what was going on in poor communities, and that you had to give hope, and hope had to meet on its bones. And meat means jobs and good education. And he worried very much that we might be buying into a dying house or a burning house with the excessive values of militarism, materialism, and individualism. And I must say, he's as prescient today as he was 50 years ago. He called it as he saw it. And so here we're faced now with, I think, a real crisis in America about whether we're going to move forward. How do we reverse this extraordinary redistribution of wealth upwards? Where you have a few billionaires with massive amounts of money, an extraordinary number of poor people, and the chance that we're going to have downward mobility among our children, particularly our children in the minority. How do we deal with the massive incarceration that is criminalizing people of color and destroying black families and costing huge amounts of money? How do we have some semblance of commitment to ending poverty? And the president has tried to do the best he knows how. He inherited an extraordinarily complicated set of issues. But you know, this is the best budget we've ever had for children of the poor. Nobody knows it. On the other hand, he cannot deal with both things in the war and with the extraordinary problems in this recession unless we have outside voices. And women have to be a key. Women have to speak up. Young people have to speak up. And so I think that the challenge now is trying to find new theater, new ways of trying to get people to get attention. Nobody pays much attention to the marches anymore. We've got to find new ways of building movement. It's going to have to be grassroots. It's going to have to come from outside the Beltway. It's going to have to be multiracial. It's going to have a strong women's voice. Frankly, the women are just going to tell men to get out of the way. And I think that you know, white privilege is very strong, and white male privilege is very strong. So this is a new movement time, but far more complicated than the simple issues of inequality in the 60s, and how do we step up to the plate and try to make that happen. So we'll have that in the Q&A period.
Well, thank you very much, Marian. You just got a movement building 101 there.